It's just a different brand, Carol. It does the same thing, but for half the price. My son-in-law, Mark, slid the cheap plastic bottle across my daughter's granite countertop. It rattled next to the sugar bowl. The air conditioner hummed, a low, constant noise in their big, quiet house. Outside, the morning was already hot and sticky. I looked at the bottle. The label was plain, the name unfamiliar. It wasn't my medication. Mark, Dr. Evans was very specific, I said, keeping my voice steady. The generic version of this one gives me side effects. We tried it years ago. My daughter, Susan, wouldn't look at me. She was busy wiping down a counter that was already perfectly clean. The scent of lemon spray filled the air. Mum, we have to watch our budget. The kids' braces are going to cost a fortune. Exactly, Mark said, leaning back. He crossed his arms over his chest. It's about being practical. We're all making sacrifices. I looked from his face to my daughter's back. A sacrifice. That's what I was. A line item on their budget that needed to be trimmed. I picked up my purse from the floor. The worn leather felt smooth under my fingers. I see, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just stood up. And the kitchen suddenly felt very cold. That afternoon I sat in my little apartment. The sun streamed through the window, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. I pulled out the old photo album. There was the picture of Susan and Mark, standing in front of this very house. They were so young, holding a big cardboard key I'd had made for them. I remembered the day they closed on the house. Their loan wasn't quite enough. I took the money my bill had left me, the money we'd saved for a trip to see the autumn leaves in Vermont, and I gave it to them for the down payment. I never said a word about it again. It's an investment in our family, I had told Susan. She had hugged me so tight, her face wet with tears. Oh, Mama, we'll pay you back every penny. They never did, of course. I never expected them to. I turned the page. There were the grandkids, Michael and Jessica, making mud pies in my small backyard. For 10 years, I watched them every summer, from June to August. It saved Susan and Mark a fortune in daycare. I remembered the feel of their sticky hands in mine, the sound of their laughter mixing with the drone of the lawnmowers in the neighborhood. I had thought I was building a foundation of love. I was wrong. I was just being convenient. I tried the new pills for 3 days. My ankles swelled up so much I couldn't get my church shoes on. A fuzzy, tired feeling settled behind my eyes, like a wool blanket had been thrown over my thoughts. The ticking of my mantel clock sounded like a hammer against my skull. Even the taste of my morning tea was off. I called Susan. I could hear cartoons blaring in the background. Susan, dear, I'm not feeling well, I said. My ankles are very swollen. There was a sigh on the other end of the line. Mum, it takes time for your body to adjust. Mark looked it up online. It said, swelling is a common side effect at first. But Dr. Evans told me if my ankles swell, I need to call him immediately, I said. My own voice sounded weak and far away. Just give it a week, Mum, please. For us? She asked. The noise in the background got louder. I have to go. Jessica is spilling her juice. The line went dead. For us. The words echoed in the silent room. My health was something I had to endure for their financial comfort. The next morning, I couldn't ignore the lightheadedness anymore. I sat by the phone for a long time, my hand hovering over the receiver. I didn't want to bother my doctor on a Saturday. Instead, I called the 24-hour nurse line on the back of my Medicare card. The phone felt cool and heavy in my hand. A calm, professional voice answered. Nurse hotline. This is Maria speaking. I explained the situation in a low voice. I told her about my condition, my proper medication, and the new pills my son-in-law had brought me. I didn't say anything about the money. I just stated the facts. Maria listened without interrupting. The silence on her end of the line was a comfort. "Mom," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you should never switch a heart medication without your doctor's direct approval. Was this new prescription called in by Dr. Evans?" "No," I whispered. "My son-in-law. He just picked it up." There was a careful pause. "I see. Ma'am, your doctor prescribed the brand name for a reason. Swelling and dizziness are serious warning signs. I strongly advise you to stop taking the new medication and go back to your prescribed one immediately." I hung up the phone. The house was quiet. I looked at the little pile of mail on my coffee table. On top was my bank statement. I had my social security check. I had the nest egg Bill had insisted I keep separate. It wasn't a lot, but it was mine. It was for emergencies. And I decided this was an emergency. The bell on the pharmacy door jingled as I walked in. The air smelled of antiseptic and that sweet dust from the candy aisle. Mr. Henderson, the pharmacist, looked up from behind the counter. He had known me for 20 years. "Well, hello, Carol," he said, a kind smile on his face. "We were wondering about you. Your son-in-law was in last week, said you were switching things up." I placed my old, empty bottle on the counter. The good one. "There was a misunderstanding, Jim," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I'll be handling my own prescriptions from now on. Please refill this for me." He nodded, no questions asked. I paid for it with my own debit card. The click of the machine sealing the transaction was the most satisfying sound I'd heard all week. Walking back to my car, clutching the small white paper bag, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. That afternoon, I found the number for a local lawyer who specialized in elder care. I made an appointment. My health was not going to be a committee decision. Not anymore. The lawyer's office was on the second floor above the hardware store. It didn't smell like a fancy downtown firm. It smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the faint aroma of coffee from a machine humming in the corner. Mr. Davis was a man about my late husband's age, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. I sat in the worn leather chair across from his big wooden desk. I explained what happened with the medication. I didn't cry or raise my voice. I just told him the facts, the way you'd read a grocery list. He listened, nodding slowly, his pen still on the notepad. "So your daughter, Susan, is currently your medical power of attorney?" he asked when I was finished. "Yes," I said. "We set it up years ago after Bill passed." He leaned forward slightly. "And what is it you would like to do now, Carol?" "I want to make sure my medical decisions are mine," I said, looking right at him. "They are not a family vote. They are not a line item in someone else's budget." I felt the cool, smooth leather of the chair against my back. It helped me feel grounded. A few days later, my phone rang in the evening. It was Susan. The sound of a television quiz show buzzed in the background of her call. "Mom? I was just looking at the credit card statement online. There's a charge from Henderson's Pharmacy. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands." "Yes, dear. I bought my medication." There was a pause. I could hear Mark's voice murmuring to her. "But Mom, I told you. Mark got your pills for the month," she said, her voice a little strained. "We're all trying to be practical here." That word again. Practical. As if my well-being was an inconvenience. "Susan, my health is not an area where I can afford to be practical," I said calmly. "I'm feeling much better now that I'm back on the right prescription. Don't you worry about it." "But the cost?" she started. I said, "Don't you worry about it," I repeated, my voice soft but firm. "I have it handled." I took a sip of my tea before she could argue further. "How is Jessica's spelling test coming along?" The subject was changed. She knew it, and I knew it. My regular checkup with Dr. Evans was the following Tuesday. The office always had the same faint smell of rubbing alcohol and clean laundry. I sat on the crinkly paper of the exam table and told him everything. He put down his pen and looked at me over his glasses, his face serious. "Carol, you absolutely did the right thing," he said. "Switching this medication without my oversight is dangerous. I'm glad you listened to your body and called that nurse line." He told me he wanted to arrange for a home health nurse to stop by once a week, just to check my blood pressure and make sure everything was stable. "Her name is Maria," he said. "She's wonderful." When Maria came to my apartment for the first time, she smiled and her whole face lit up. She had a warm, steady presence. As she unpacked her blood pressure cuff, I listened to her voice. "Your voice sounds familiar," I said. She looked up at me, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "I work part-time for the nurse hotline. I was on duty last Saturday." We looked at each other for a moment. The woman who had been a calm, disembodied voice in my moment of fear was now sitting in my living room. The afternoon sun made a warm patch on my braided rug. I felt a sense of trust that I hadn't felt in a very long time. The papers from Mr. Davis sat on my kitchen table for 2 days. I would make my coffee in the morning and look at them. Living will. Durable power of attorney for health care. The crisp legal documents felt heavy. My first thought was to name my sister, but she lived 3 states away and had her own health problems. I thought of my friend Betty from church, but she got flustered in a crisis. I needed someone clear-headed, someone who understood medicine, someone whose only interest was my health. I picked up the phone and called Maria. I asked her if she had a moment to talk. "Maria, this is going to sound very forward," I said, my heart beating a little faster. "I have a very important question to ask you." I explained the situation and what the paperwork meant. She was quiet on the other end of the line. "Carol," she finally said, her voice full of warmth and gravity. "I would be honored, but this is a great responsibility. You need to be absolutely sure." "I am sure," I said, looking at the sunlight on my clean kitchen counter. "I need someone who sees my health as a priority, not an expense." There was a quiet click as I put the receiver back in its cradle. I picked up my best pen and signed my name on the line Mr. Davis had marked with a little yellow tab. That Sunday, I went to Susan and Mark's for dinner. The house smelled of roast chicken and garlic. The kids were running through the sprinkler in the backyard, their shrieks of laughter floating in through the open screen door. The tension at the dinner table, however, was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark cleared his throat after a few bites. "Carol, we really need to discuss this pharmacy situation. We can't have you making these kinds of financial decisions on your own. We're a family, we're a team." I took a slow sip of my iced water. The glass was cool against my skin. I didn't look at him. I looked at Susan. "There's nothing to discuss, Mark. My medical care has been handled." Susan put her fork down. "What do you mean, handled?" I gave her a small, calm smile. In my purse, resting on the floor beside me, were the copies of my signed legal documents. "It means you and Mark don't have to worry about it anymore," I said, my voice even and light. "It's all taken care of. Now you can focus on saving for those braces." A thick manila envelope arrived in the mail. My name and address were typed neatly on the front. I sat at my kitchen table and slit it open with my butter knife. The papers inside were crisp and important looking, with a notary's seal pressed into the last page. I held the signed copy of my new healthcare power of attorney. Maria's name was listed clearly as my agent. Susan's name was gone. I put the envelope in the top drawer of my nightstand, underneath a stack of old handkerchiefs that had belonged to my mother. They smelled faintly of lavender. Later that day, Maria came for her weekly visit. She took my blood pressure and listened to my heart. Her touch was gentle and professional. "Everything looks good, Carol," she said, packing her things. "The swelling in your ankles is completely gone." "I feel much better," I told her. And it was the truth. I received the paperwork from the lawyer. She paused at the door and gave me a warm, steady look. "I'm here if you need anything. Just a phone call away." I knew she wasn't just talking about blood pressure cuffs. My phone rang on a Thursday afternoon. It was Susan. Her voice was bright and a little too fast. "Mum, I have the best news. Jessica made the travel soccer team." "Oh, that's wonderful, dear," I said. I could hear the clatter of dishes in her background. "It is. The only thing is, the fees are a little steep. And the uniforms, well, you know how it is." She took a breath. "Mark and I were thinking, since you're not paying for that expensive prescription anymore." I stopped her. "Susan, I am paying for it. I'm paying for it myself." The line went quiet for a second. "Oh, well, we were just thinking, it's about being practical. A little help would go a long way for the kids." I looked out my window at the little bird feeder I had just filled. A small blue jay was pecking at the seeds. "I'm so proud of Jessica," I said, my voice perfectly pleasant. "But I'm afraid I can't help with the fees this time. My budget is very tight right now." Her sigh was audible. "Okay, Mom. I just thought I'd ask." The call ended quickly after that. The blue jay flew away. That Saturday, I joined the community garden. My friend Betty from church had been telling me about it for years. I was assigned a small, sunny plot next to a man named Arthur, who was growing enormous tomatoes. The air smelled of rich earth and marigolds. My knees complained a little as I knelt on the soft ground, but my hands felt right at home in the dirt. Betty came over to inspect my work, holding a watering can. "It's good to see you out here, Carol. You seem lighter, somehow." I pushed a small basil seedling into the soil. The warmth of the sun felt good on my back. "I've just been doing some rearranging in my life, Betty, getting my house in order." "Is everything all right with Susan and Mark?" she asked, lowering her voice. I patted the soil around the little plant. "Everything is exactly as it should be," I said. I wasn't dying. I was just becoming an inconvenience to their plans, and that was a price I was willing to pay. They showed up on Sunday evening without calling first. I was watching my favorite nature show when the doorbell rang. It was Susan and Mark. Susan was holding a casserole dish covered in foil. It was still warm. Mark stood behind her, his arms crossed. "We were worried, Mum," Susan said, walking past me into my living room. "You've been so distant." Mark shut the door behind him. "Your daughter is worried sick. And frankly, Carol, refusing to help with Jessica's soccer fees was not a team player move. We're a family." I turned off the television. The sudden silence in the room was heavy. "I have my own expenses to manage," I said simply. "Like what?" Mark challenged, his voice sharp. "That brand-name medicine you insisted on?" I stood up and faced them. I was not angry. I was not sad. I was just done. "My medical decisions are no longer your concern. I had Mr. Davis, my lawyer, draw up new papers. I have appointed a new healthcare agent." Susan's face went pale. She set the casserole down on my coffee table with a thud. You did what? Who? Betty from church? No, I said, my voice as calm as a quiet lake. My nurse, Maria. She is a medical professional whose only concern is my health. I looked at my daughter, and then at her husband. You can't put a price tag on a mother, but you certainly tried. They left a few minutes later. Susan was crying. Mark was furious, his face tight and red. He didn't say goodbye. I heard their car door slam and the engine roar to life before they sped down the street. The casserole sat on my coffee table, forgotten. I walked over and picked it up. It was my favorite, chicken and broccoli. I carried it into the kitchen and scraped the entire thing into the trash can. The smell of it filled the room, but I didn't feel hungry. I went back to my armchair and sat down in the quiet. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't turn the television back on. I just sat there, listening to the house settle around me. After a while, I noticed the evening light filtering through the lace curtains, making patterns on the rug. A great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It was a strange feeling, this mix of sorrow and freedom. But the freedom was winning. The phone calls started the next day. The first was from Susan, her voice thick with tears. Mum, how could you do this to me? To us, after everything we've done for you? I was watering my new basil plant on the windowsill. The leaves smelled green and peppery. Susan, this wasn't done to you. This was done for me. But a stranger. You chose a stranger over your own daughter, she cried. Maria is not a stranger. She is a medical professional who respects my doctor's orders, I said, my voice gentle but firm. This is not about love, dear. It is about trust and competence. I need to go now. My gardening class is starting. I hung up before she could reply. Mark called that evening. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Carol, I've spoken to a lawyer. You can't just cut your daughter out like that. We have rights. I was knitting a small blue baby blanket for a church charity drive. The soft yarn slipped through my fingers, a comforting rhythm. Mark, I haven't cut Susan out of my life. I have only removed her from my medical decisions. There is a difference. This is ridiculous, he sputtered. It's just a different brand of pill. We were trying to be practical. My life is not a business transaction, Mark, I said calmly. The clicking of my knitting needles was the only other sound. And my health is not up for a vote. I suggest you drop this. Mr. Davis was very thorough. I heard him breathing heavily on the other end, but he didn't have a response. Maria's weekly visits became a highlight of my week. We would sit at my kitchen table after she checked my vitals, and we'd drink tea. She told me about her son who was studying to be an engineer. I told her about my Bill and how he used to build model airplanes on this very table. The air in my apartment felt lighter, filled with easy conversation instead of unspoken tension. One afternoon, she looked at the new healthcare proxy paperwork I kept in a folder on the counter. Are you sure about this, Carol? It could cause a permanent rift with your daughter. I looked out the window at the community garden. My tomato plants were starting to flower. A rift was already there, Maria. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. They built the bridge, and I just decided not to cross it anymore. She nodded slowly, her eyes understanding. Well, you won't have to worry. I will always follow your wishes and your doctor's orders to the letter. The simple promise felt like a warm blanket. The next Sunday at church, I saw Susan and Mark across the sanctuary. They were with the children. Susan wouldn't look at me. She kept her head down, focused on the hymnal in her hands. Little Jessica waved, a small, hopeful flutter of her fingers, before her mother gently pulled her hand down. My heart ached for a moment, a familiar pang. After the service, during the coffee hour in the fellowship hall, a few people came up to me. The air smelled of weak coffee and powdered donuts. Betty gave my arm a squeeze. "Thinking of you," she whispered. Then Mark's mother, Eleanor, cornered me by the cookie table. "Carol, I am just shocked," she said, her voice a loud whisper. "Susan is heartbroken. To think you'd put a paid nurse in charge of your life. It's just not what a family does." I picked up a napkin and carefully selected an oatmeal raisin cookie. "Eleanor, what a family doesn't do is replace a mother's life-saving medication with a cheap alternative to save money for soccer uniforms." I took a bite of my cookie and looked her right in the eye. "It's funny what different people consider practical, isn't it?" She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, and for once had nothing to say. A week went by, with no calls. The silence was a relief. I spent my mornings at the garden and my afternoons reading books from the library. Arthur, my tomato-growing neighbour, showed me how to pinch back the suckers on my plants to make them stronger. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they moved with a gentle confidence in the dirt. "You've got a real knack for this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My husband always said I could make a stick grow," I replied, smiling at the memory. The sun was warm on my face. One evening, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, it was Jessica, my granddaughter, standing there alone. She was holding a slightly wilted bouquet of dandelions. "Hi, Grandma," she said in a small voice. "Mommy doesn't know I'm here. I took a shortcut through the park." My heart squeezed. I knelt down, my knees creaking in protest. "Well, hello, sweetheart. It's not safe to come by yourself." "I know," she whispered, handing me the dandelions. "But I missed you." I took the flowers from her small, warm hand and led her inside. This, I knew, was a problem for another day. For now, there was a little girl in my house who needed a glass of milk and a cookie. I put the dandelions in a little juice glass with water and set them on the kitchen table. They were already starting to droop, but they were a precious gift. I gave Jessica an oatmeal cookie and a glass of milk. Her small fingers left smudges on the cold glass. "Grandma, are you mad at Mommy?" she asked, her voice muffled by the cookie. I sat down across from her. "No, sweetheart. Grown-ups just have disagreements sometimes. It doesn't change how much I love you, and it doesn't change how much your mommy loves you." She seemed to accept that. After she finished her cookie, I picked up the phone. I kept my voice low and calm. "Susan, dear, it's Mom. Don't be alarmed, but Jessica is here with me. She's perfectly safe." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by a frantic jumble of words. "What? How? Is she okay?" "She's fine. She walked over," I said. "But you need to come and get her now." I gave her my address, as if she didn't know it by heart. Then I hung up. 10 minutes later, Susan's car screeched to a halt at the curb. She ran to the door, her face pale and her hair messy. She didn't even knock, just pushed it open. "Jessica!" Jessica ran into her mother's arms. Susan hugged her so tightly I thought the little girl might pop. She checked her over from head to toe before finally looking at me, her eyes flashing with a mixture of relief and anger. "How could you let this happen? Anything could have happened to her." "She showed up at my door 5 minutes before I called you, Susan," I said, my voice even. I refused to be the target of her panic. "The question is, how did she manage to slip away from your house without you noticing?" Susan's face flushed. She didn't have an answer for that. She just grabbed Jessica's hand. "We're leaving." "Of course," I said. I knelt down and gave Jessica a hug. I could smell the faint scent of soap from her bath. "You listen to your mummy, sweetheart. No more secret trips, okay?" She nodded into my shoulder. Susan pulled her away and left without another word. The screen door slammed shut behind them, leaving the house in silence. The next Saturday at the community garden, the sun was warm and the air smelled of damp earth and fertilizer. I was trying to tie one of my tomato plants to a stake. My fingers felt clumsy. "Here, let me show you," a low voice said. It was Arthur. He gently took the twine from my hands. "You make a figure 8. That way it gives the stem room to grow without choking it." He made a quick, deft loop, and the plant was secure. "Oh, thank you," I said, feeling a little flustered. "You make it look so easy." He smiled, a slow, kind smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Been doing it for 50 years. You pick up a few tricks." He pointed to a particularly large, dark red tomato on his own vine. "That one's a Cherokee purple. It'll be ready in a day or two. I'll save it for you. You haven't lived until you've had a real sun-warmed tomato." I found myself smiling back. It felt nice. Susan called on Tuesday. Her voice was different this time. It was quiet, without the sharp edge of anger. "Mum, I'm sorry about how I acted the other day. I was just so scared." "I know you were, dear," I said. I was polishing my good silver, a task I always found calming. The familiar smell of the polish filled my small kitchen. "Mark and I were talking," she continued, and I braced myself. "We just feel like there's been so much misunderstanding. We never meant to upset you. We were just trying to help manage things, to make life easier for everyone." It was a careful, rehearsed speech, an apology that wasn't really an apology. "I appreciate the thought, Susan. But as I said, everything is managed now. You don't have to worry." "But it feels so strange," she said, her voice dropping. "Having a stranger in charge of you. What if something happens?" "Then a qualified medical professional will make a decision based on my doctor's advice," I said, rubbing a soft cloth over a teaspoon until it gleamed. "That's the whole point." The conversation ended soon after. No one mentioned money. That weekend, I saw a flyer at the library for a local historical society meeting. The topic was the old textile mill that used to be the biggest employer in town. My Bill had worked there for a summer when he was a boy. On an impulse, I decided to go. The meeting was in the library's basement. The room smelled of dusty books and mildew. There were about 20 people there, mostly my age. Arthur from the garden was there, sitting in the back row. He waved me over. The speaker was a young man with a lot of passion. He showed old black and white photos on a projector screen. Afterwards, Arthur and I stood by the refreshments table, eating lemon cookies. "My father worked at that mill his whole life," he said, looking at the faded photos. "My husband did too for one summer," I said. We talked for a while about the town and how much it had changed. Walking home in the cool evening air, I felt a sense of connection, not just to Arthur, but to the place I had lived my whole life. My world felt like it was getting a little bigger, and I was the one opening the doors. A few days after the Historical Society meeting, Arthur left a brown paper bag on my doorstep. Inside were 3 enormous Cherokee purple tomatoes. They were heavy in my hands, still warm from the sun. The rich, earthy smell reminded me of my father's garden from long ago. I sliced one for lunch with a little salt and pepper. It was the best tomato I had ever tasted. I brought the empty bag back to his garden plot the next day. Arthur, that was the kindest thought, I said. It was absolutely delicious. He was weeding his bean patch, his back to me. Glad you enjoyed it, he said, not turning around. Plenty more where that came from. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. I found myself looking forward to my mornings at the garden more and more. The first chill of autumn was in the air. The leaves on the maple tree outside my window were starting to turn yellow at the edges. One afternoon, I was sorting through old boxes in my closet. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and mothballs. I found a small, locked metal box. It was where Bill and I kept our important papers. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened it. Inside were our marriage certificate, the deed to our first house, and our wills. We had made them 30 years ago, simple documents, leaving everything to each other, and then to Susan. I looked at my signature, the handwriting of a much younger woman. I called Mr. Davis the next day. I think it's time to update my will, I said, my voice steady. A wise decision, he said. Things change. It's good to keep your affairs in order. We made an appointment for the following week. It felt like another piece of my house was being put right. My granddaughter Jessica's birthday was in October. Susan called to invite me to the party. Her voice was strained, but polite. It's at that bouncy castle place out by the highway, Mum. Saturday at 2. The kids would love to see you. Of course, I'll be there, I said. I wouldn't punish the children for the foolishness of their parents. I bought Jessica a beautiful book of classic fairy tales with coloured illustrations. When I arrived at the party, the air was filled with the roar of air blowers and the shrieks of excited children. The place smelled of popcorn and sweaty socks. I saw Mark across the room, talking to another father. He gave me a curt nod and then turned his back. Susan took the gift from me with a tight smile. Thank you, Mum. You shouldn't have. It's a birthday, dear. Of course I should have, I said. I found a chair in a relatively quiet corner and watched Jessica bounce with her friends, her face flushed with pure joy. Later, while the children were eating pizza, Mark's mother, Eleanor, sat down next to me. The plastic chair creaked under her weight. Carol, I do hope you've reconsidered that business with your power of attorney, she said, fanning herself with a paper plate. It's causing such a terrible strain. Susan is beside herself. Eleanor, my decisions are made, I said, watching my grandson Michael try to build a tower out of pizza crusts. They are not up for discussion, especially not at a child's birthday party. But family is everything, she insisted. You have to be practical. I turned to look at her. The noise of the party seemed to fade away. Being practical is what got us here, Eleanor. They were being practical when they decided my health was a negotiable expense. I am just being practical now, by ensuring it never happens again. She had no reply. She just picked up her purse and moved to another table. As I was getting ready to leave, Susan walked me to the door. The roar from the party was slightly muffled in the entryway. Mom, Mark is thinking about refinancing the house, she said, her voice low. The interest rates are better now. It would really help with the monthly payments. I looked at her. Her face was tired. There were little lines of worry around her eyes that I hadn't seen before. That sounds like a good idea, I said carefully. The thing is, she hesitated, fiddling with the zipper on her jacket. The bank wants to see all our assets. They asked about, any future inheritance. It would help our application if we could show. I finally understood. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about worry. It was about my money. It had always been about the money. I put my hand on her arm. The fabric of her jacket was cool and slick. Susan, I said, my voice soft. You and Mark need to make your financial plans without counting on me. My house is in order. You should focus on getting yours in order too. I walked out into the cool autumn air, leaving her standing in the doorway. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I felt a profound sense of sadness, but also a clean, clear sense of resolve. The path ahead was mine alone, and for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare me at all. I met with Mr. Davis the following Wednesday. His office still smelled of old paper and floor wax, a scent I now found comforting. We sat at his big desk, a fresh yellow legal pad between us. So, Carol, he said, putting on his reading glasses, what changes did you have in mind for your will? I took a deep breath. The words had been practicing themselves in my head for days. I want to set up a trust for my grandchildren's education, I said. A specific amount, to be managed by the bank, paid directly to their colleges when the time comes? He nodded, making a note. All right. And the remainder of the estate? I want to leave a small bequest to the community garden, I said, thinking of Arthur's tomatoes and the feel of the sun on my back. And one to the Historical Society. The rest. I paused. I want the rest to go to my daughter, Susan. Mr. Davis looked up at me over his glasses. Even after everything? Yes, I said. She is my only child. But there will be a condition. Mark is not to be a co-signer or have any access to the inheritance. It is for Susan and the children only. It wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. Protecting what Bill and I had worked our whole lives for from a man who saw everything, including my health, as a budget line. Thanksgiving was approaching. The air grew crisp, and the days grew shorter. I didn't receive an invitation to dinner at Susan and Mark's house. The silence from their phone was loud and clear. It hurt, but it didn't surprise me. Instead, my friend Betty from church invited me to her family's Thanksgiving. It's just chaos, Carol. You'll love it, she'd said. My sister brings a Jell-O salad that glows in the dark. On Thanksgiving morning, I baked my famous apple pie. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled my small apartment. It was a smell that always meant family. As I crimped the edges of the crust, I felt a pang of sadness for what was lost. But then I looked at the pie, golden and perfect, and thought about sharing it with new friends. Betty's house was noisy and warm, filled with the sounds of laughter and a football game blaring from the television. The air smelled of turkey and sage stuffing. No one asked me about Susan. No one looked at me with pity. They just handed me a plate and asked if I preferred light meat or dark. It was the most relaxing holiday I'd had in years. In early December, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. It was a man from the bank. Mrs. Miller? This is Tom Jenkins from the mortgage department. I'm calling regarding an application from Mark and Susan Peterson. They've listed you as a potential financial guarantor. I sat down in my armchair, the phone feeling cold against my ear. They had gone ahead and done it. They had used my name without my permission. I see, I said, my voice betraying no emotion. And what is it you need from me? Well, we'd just need you to come in and sign some paperwork, pledging a certain amount of your assets to secure their refinancing loan, he said cheerfully. I looked at the little glass with the wilted dandelions Jessica had given me, which I still kept on my windowsill. Mr. Jenkins, I said, my voice clear and calm. I am afraid there has been a serious mistake. I will not be signing anything. I am in no way financially involved with Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. There was a stunned silence on the other end. Oh, he finally managed. I must have been misinformed. I'm very sorry to have bothered you. I hung up the phone. The quiet revenge was the simple, undeniable truth. A week later, Susan showed up at my door. It was snowing lightly, the first real snow of the season. She wasn't wearing a hat, and flakes of snow were melting in her hair. She looked tired and defeated. She didn't try to come in. She just stood on the welcome mat. "The bank called us," she said, her voice flat. "They denied the refinancing." "I know," I said. "They called me." Her eyes filled with tears. "Why, Mom? Why would you do that to us? We're drowning. Mark might have to take a second job." I didn't open the door any wider. The cold air rushed around my ankles. "What I did, Susan, was tell the truth. I am not your financial safety net. You and your husband are adults. You cannot build your financial future on my foundation. It's not strong enough to hold you both." "But we're your family," she cried, the words turning into a sob. "I know you are," I said, and my heart broke a little for her, for me, for all of it. "But that doesn't make me your bank. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet." I gently closed the door, leaving her standing in the falling snow. Christmas was quiet. I went to the candlelight service at church on Christmas Eve. The scent of pine from the wreaths and melting wax from the candles filled the air. I saw Arthur there, sitting alone a few pews ahead of me. We walked out together into the cold, clear night. The church bells were ringing. "Merry Christmas, Carol," he said, his breath making a small cloud in the air. "Merry Christmas, Arthur," I replied. He pressed a small, lumpy package into my hand. It was wrapped in newspaper and tied with kitchen twine. "It's my grandmother's recipe for tomato jam," he said gruffly. "Goes good on toast." I smiled. "Thank you." I spent Christmas Day at home, listening to old records and reading my new book. The little jar of tomato jam sat on my kitchen counter. It felt more precious than any expensive gift. My life was smaller now in some ways, but it was also richer. It was mine. The winter months passed quietly. The snow fell, covering the bare plots in the community garden with a clean white blanket. I joined a book club at the library. We met on Tuesdays in a cozy room that smelled of old books and peppermint tea. I even started volunteering at the local elementary school, helping first graders learn to read. One little boy, Leo, struggled with his letters. He would wrinkle his nose in frustration. I'd sit with him in a small chair, the scent of chalk dust and Elmer's glue in the air. "Let's try it again," I'd say, my voice patient. One afternoon, he finally read a whole sentence by himself. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with pride. "I did it," he shouted. The feeling in my heart was warmer than any holiday dinner. I was useful again, but this time on my own terms. As the first crocuses began to push through the melting snow, I received a letter. The envelope had my daughter's handwriting on it. I let it sit on my kitchen table for a full day before I opened it. The letter was short. "Mum," it read, "Mark got a second job on weekends. It's been hard, but we are managing. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I'm sorry. I know I let you down. I let Mark's talk about money and being practical get in the way of being a daughter. I hope one day you can forgive me. Love, Susan." There was no request for money. There were no excuses. It was just an apology. I folded the letter and put it away in a drawer with my mother's old handkerchiefs. Forgiveness was a complicated thing. It wasn't a switch you could just flip. It was more like a garden. It needed time and tending. Spring arrived in full force. The community garden came back to life. Arthur and I worked side by side, turning over the soil and pulling the first weeds. He had built a small wooden bench over the winter, and he placed it between our two plots. "For when our backs give out," he said, with a small smile. Sometimes we would sit there in the late afternoon sun, not talking much, just watching our seedlings grow. He told me about his wife, who had passed away 5 years earlier. I told him about Bill. We didn't try to fix each other's loneliness. We just acknowledged it, like a shared landmark. It was a comfortable silence. One day, he asked me to go with him to the hardware store to pick out new tomato cages. We ended up getting coffee at the diner next door. The air smelled of coffee and bacon. It wasn't a date. It was just nice. It was company. My 70th birthday came in June. Maria, my nurse, brought me a small cake when she came for her weekly visit. Betty and my book club friends took me out for lunch. Arthur gave me a beautiful potted orchid. "It's supposed to be hard to kill," he said. That evening, my doorbell rang. It was Susan, alone. She was holding a small, clumsily wrapped gift. "Happy birthday, Mum," she said, her voice quiet. I invited her in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had decided to take back my life. She gave me the gift. It was a framed photo of me and her as a little girl, sitting on the porch swing of our old house. "I found it in a box," she said. We looked happy. "We were," I said. We sat in silence for a moment. "Thank you for the letter, Susan." She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I meant it." "I know," I said. "Would you like a cup of tea?" It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. A tiny seed planted in the turned-over soil. The summer evenings were long and warm. I often sat on my small balcony, a glass of iced tea in my hand, watching the fireflies begin to blink in the twilight. The air smelled of cut grass and the roses blooming in my neighbour's yard. My life was not what I had planned. It was quieter. It was simpler. But it was whole. I had my garden, my books, and my friends. My health was stable. My mind was clear. I was not a burden. I was not a budget item. I was just Carol. One evening, Arthur and I were sitting on his bench at the garden, watching the sun set behind the trees. The sky was a beautiful mix of purple and gold. My tomato plants were heavy with green fruit. "It's going to be a good harvest this year," he said. I looked at the neat rows of vegetables, at the rich, dark earth. I felt the gentle evening breeze on my skin. He was right. It was going to be a very good harvest. And I had planted it all myself.